There is this very specific, honestly slightly maddening feeling that I think a lot of people are having right now. You turn on the news or scroll your feed, and you just see these headlines screaming at you like the economy is strong, growth is exceeding
Oh,
expectations.
yeah, the classic green arrow effect.
Right. The assumption is just, if the arrow on the screen is green and it's pointing up, well, then everything must be perfectly fine for everyone.
Right, but it's a huge disconnect.
Exactly, because then you close your laptop, you drive to the grocery store, or you just look at your own savings account, and it's like, wait,
Hmm.
if the economy is winning so hard right now, why does it feel like I'm just treading water
Yeah.
or, actively sinking?
Yeah, that is the reality for a lot of people.
And usually when we try to actually dig into that feeling, that gap between the evening news and our actual reality, we just run headfirst into a brick wall of three letters, GDP.
It really is the absolute celebrity of economic acronyms. I mean, it just sucks all the oxygen out of the room.
It's treated like the final score of the Super Bowl. But here's the thing, and I'll totally admit, until we started prepping for this deep dive, I was completely guilty of this too. Very few of us actually stopped to ask, what exactly is that number counting?
Hmm.
And maybe more importantly, what is it completely ignoring?
Which is the billion-dollar question. Because when you rely on a single number to define the entire complexity of a nation's well-being, you are inherently going to miss a massive part of the picture. You're essentially looking at the engine speed on the dashboard, but you might be ignoring the fact that, I don't know, the car's on fire or heading off a cliff.
That is a terrifying image, but actually a really helpful one. So welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are popping the hood. We've got a really great stack of research here titled Beyond GDP, Multidimensional Metrics of Economic Growth.
Mm.
And our mission today is to decode this alphabet soup. So we're going to tackle GDP, GNP, CPI, basically all the greatest hits.
And just to be clear right up front, the goal here isn't to just, memorize definitions so you can crush it at bar trivia. It's to understand why these metrics actually matter to you, the individual listener. We really need to parse the difference between growth, which is just getting bigger, and actual progress.
Yeah, speaking of progress, I want to plant a little flag here for something we're going to hit a bit later in the discussion. There is this thought experiment in the source material that genuinely kept me up last night. It basically asks, if the government forced us all to work a 50-hour week instead of a 44-hour week, the economy would technically get bigger. The numbers would look amazing, but would we actually be better off?
The ultimate showdown between quantity and quality.
It really is. It makes you question the whole treadmill we're on. But before we get to the existential crisis of our work-life balance, we do have to start with the heavyweight champion itself, gross domestic product.
Let's do it.
Okay, so let's just strip away the jargon for a second. When we say GDP, what are we actually measuring? Because I think most people just hear it and assume it means money.
Well, it's a bit more specific than just money. At its most basic level, gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders during a specific period. And, usually we look at that quarterly or annually.
The key word there being domestic, right? Within the borders.
Precisely. Geography is the absolute defining factor here. It literally doesn't matter if the factory is owned by a French conglomerate, a Chinese tech giant, or just a local family business. If the welding, the assembling, the coding, the selling, if all of that happens on American soil, it counts toward American GDP.
Now, the research mentions that GDP acts as a proxy for monetary expenditures. That sounds a little, I don't know, abstract.
Yeah.
Why do we need a proxy at all? Why can't we just count the stuff we make?
Well, think about the sheer scale of an economy like the United States. It is physically impossible to count every single item produced. You can't have a guy with a clipboard standing at the end of every assembly line.
Or sitting in every barber shop.
Right, or tracking every single app download on a smartphone. It just can't be done.
Yeah, that would be a complete logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
I mean, the census every 10 years is hard enough.
Exactly. So instead of counting the physical items, you count the value of the items. You just follow the money. The source actually uses the steel industry as a prime example of this. If a statistician wants to figure out the output of the steel industry, they don't go out and count the steel beams. They track the dollar value of all the steel that enters the market.
Okay, so you follow the money. If I buy a steel beam for $100, that's $100 of GDP.
Exactly. And if you do that for steel, and then you do it for agriculture and technology and healthcare, and you combine all those dollar outputs, voila. You have the total production, you have the GDP. It's essentially just a measure of aggregate expenditures.
Which honestly sounds logical. If people are spending money, the economy is moving. If the number is big, we're making a lot of stuff. But here is where the source material points out a pretty glaring flaw, And I really want to dig into this because it feels kind of counterintuitive. Just because money is moving around, does that actually mean we're getting better at making things? Or are we just spending more?
And that right there is the crux of the productivity problem. GDP measures the dollars moving, but it absolutely does not necessarily measure efficiency.
Okay, help me visualize that. How can you have economic growth without efficiency?
Well, let's use a hypothetical. Imagine an economy where we are just incredibly bad at construction. Let's say we want to build a
Yeah.
bridge, but we're completely disorganized. We waste a ton of steel. We have terrible management, and the workers are, I don't know, using spoons instead of shovels.
Okay, so it's just a total disaster project.
A total disaster. It takes 5 years and costs $1 billion because of all the waste and the overtime and the delays. Now, compare that to an efficient economy that builds that exact same bridge in 1 year for just $200 million.
Well, the efficient one is obviously better. You get a bridge faster and it's way cheaper.
In reality, yes, of course. But if you look strictly at the expenditure GDP for that specific project, the disaster bridge generated way more spending. It moved more money. It kept people employed for 5 years.
Wait, so being horribly wasteful can actually pump up the GDP numbers. That seems fundamentally broken.
In the short term, pure expenditure models can be incredibly misleading like that. It's like if you break a window and pay someone to fix it, GDP goes up.
But you aren't actually richer. You just have your window back.
Right, you're back to where you started, but the numbers look like growth. That's exactly why real economic analysis cares so much about productivity. You want to measure the relationship between inputs and outputs. You want to get more bridge for less money.
So how do the actual experts deal with this? Because I have to assume the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they aren't just shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, we spent $1 billion on a bridge, we must be rich.
No, they definitely aren't doing that. The OECD fully acknowledges that GDP has these statistical blind spots. So their solution is to use GDP for what it's actually good at, which is measuring the raw size of the activity. But then they bring in a different metric entirely called multi-factor productivity, or MFP.
MFP. Okay, now we're really getting into the alphabet soup.
It sounds super technical, but just think of it as the brains metric.
Hmm.
MFP tries to measure the contribution of innovation, better management, technical organization. It's basically asking, how smartly are we combining our labor and capital?
So GDP is the brawn. It's just how much heavy lifting we did. And MFP is the brains. How smart were we about that lifting?
That's a really fair way to put it, actually. If GDP goes up but MFP is flat, you're just working harder, not smarter. Ultimately, you want both lines moving up together.
That is such a crucial distinction. Okay, so we've established that GDP is the king of domestic production. But for a really long time, there was another challenger for the throne, GNP, gross national product.
Yes. And honestly, the distinction between these two seems subtle at first, but in a highly globalized world, it is incredibly important.
So if GDP is domestic, GNP is national. It kind of sounds like semantics. What does that actually change out there in the real world?
It changes the entire lens from where to who. So while GDP looks at where the production happens, like strictly inside the borders, GNP looks at who is earning the income. GNP measures the total income of a country's citizens, regardless of where they are in the world.
Okay, so it captures the income that actually ends up in the pockets of the people who live here.
Correct. It's all about residency. It's asking the question, are the people of this nation actually getting richer?
Our source text had a really specific example about a factory that made this click for me. I want to walk through that because I think it totally exposes why this matters to the average person.
Oh, the foreign factory example. It's a classic in economics.
Right. So imagine there's a massive factory located right here in the United States. Let's say a big German car company builds a plant down in Alabama.
Okay, pretty common scenario.
Right. That factory is pumping out SUVs. It's hiring American workers. It is creating a ton of value. And since that factory is physically on U.S. soil, all of that output counts toward the U.S. GDP.
Yes, it is domestic production. That is the D in GDP.
But, and here's the twist, does it count toward the U.S. GNP?
Not the profits. No, the wages paid to those American workers, yes, those count because those workers are U.S. residents. But the profits, the return on the capital, the big dividends, those ultimately accrue to the German company. That value belongs to Germany's GNP, not ours.
That is a huge distinction. So
Yeah.
theoretically, you could have a country where the GDP looks just massive because there are foreign factories absolutely everywhere. But if they're all owned by companies from other countries,
then the GNP would be significantly lower than the GDP. In that scenario, the country is essentially just acting as a production floor, but the actual wealth is flowing out to the owners elsewhere. This happens in developing nations quite a bit, actually.
And the reverse must be true for the U.S. too, right?
Exactly. If U.S. companies own factories in Vietnam or Mexico or wherever, that production counts toward those countries' GDP. But the profits come back home to the U.S., boosting our GNP. Comparing those two numbers side by side is actually a fascinating way to see if a country is a net producer of wealth for its own people or just a net host of economic activity for others.
Now, I was really surprised to learn from our deep dive that the U.S. actually used to rely on GNP as its main headline number. Like, we were a GNP nation.
We were. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, they used GNP as the primary health indicator for the country, all the way until 1991.
1991. That's fairly recent. I mean, Nirvana was already on the radio. Why the switch? Did they suddenly realize GDP was just scientifically better?
Well, better is subjective. The primary reason the BEA cited was simply standardization. By 1991, the vast majority of the rest of the world had already standardized on GDP.
Ah, so it was just international peer pressure.
Basically, yes. If the US wanted to easily compare its economy to Japan or Germany or the UK, we needed to be speaking the exact same statistical language. It's sort of like the metric system debate, but for economists.
So we just switched to make the spreadsheets match up.
Mostly, yes. But it's important to note the BEA didn't just throw GNP in the trash. They still track it religiously because, as we just discussed, if you want to know about the actual income of your residents, you cannot ignore it.
So we've got GDP measuring the where and the spending. We've got GNP measuring the who and the earning. But this brings us to the real social much. So what portion of our deep dive? Because frankly, charts and acronyms are fine for economists, but I really want to talk about real life.
And this is where we get into the debate about productivity versus the actual standard of living.
Yeah, the source material calls this the chicken and egg debate. Production versus spending.
Right. Most economists agree that total spending is a byproduct of productive output. You produce things, you get paid for it, you spend that money. But the real question is, does increased spending always mean our lives are getting better?
And this is exactly where we get to that thought experiment I teased at the top.
Yeah.
I love this because it really exposes the blind spots of just staring at a GDP chart all day.
It really does. It forces you to look at the human cost of growth.
Okay, so let's set the scene for you. Picture the current economy. The average worker puts in, let's say, 44 productive hours a week. That's our baseline.
Okay, standard work week.
Now, imagine Congress passes a law. Maybe they are terrified of a looming recession. So they mandate that everyone must work 50 hours a week. No choice. You are at your desk or on the factory floor for 6 extra hours every single week.
That is a massive jump. That's essentially losing your entire Saturday.
Right. Now, mathematically, what happens? We are working more hours, we are producing more widgets, we're serving more customers. Total output absolutely goes up.
Which means future GDP will almost certainly be higher. If you look strictly at the expenditure model, the economy has grown, the line on the chart goes up, and politicians are going to celebrate.
But, and this is the massive but, is that real growth? Are we actually better off?
See, this is what I find so fascinating about this scenario. If your definition of growth is strictly just the volume of stuff produced, then yes, it's growth. But if you care about efficiency, or more importantly, the actual standard of living, the answer is probably no.
Because we lost something that isn't showing up on the balance sheet.
We lost time. The average worker has given up 6 hours of leisure per week, time they could have spent with their kids, resting, pursuing a hobby, or literally just sleeping.
And leisure has value. It might not have a price tag attached to it like a steel beam, but it has immense value to the actual human being living that life.
Precisely. At its core, economics is supposed to be about the allocation of scarce resources. And time is the absolute scarcest resource we have. If that loss of leisure, that exhaustion, isn't worth the extra wages they earn from those 6 hours, then the standard of living has actually declined.
Even though the GDP went up.
Even though the GDP went up. In that specific scenario, the GDP is essentially lying about the health of the society.
It reminds me of that feeling of being house rich and cash poor,
Yeah.
but on a national scale. Like, we are output rich, but time poor.
That's a fantastic way to frame it. And this highlights the fundamental limitation we all need to understand. GDP is a measure of output. It is explicitly not a measure of happiness, welfare, or well-being.
It's like measuring a car's performance entirely by how much gas it burns, but completely ignoring whether the driver is comfortable or safe. or even driving in the right direction.
Exactly. And while the OECD model we talked about earlier, with multi-factor productivity, tries to account for efficiency, even that struggles to capture the human cost of just working more. It doesn't capture burnout.
So if GDP has all these blind spots, if it ignores non-market activities like volunteer work or raising kids, and it totally ignores the quality of life, we obviously can't fly the plane with just one gauge. We clearly need a dashboard.
We need a cocktail of metrics. You just can't rely on one number.
So besides GDP and GNP, what else does our source say we really need to be monitoring if we want the actual truth about the economy?
Well, there are two other major indicators mentioned in the research that fill in some of these big gaps. The first one you actually see in the news quite a bit, the CPI, or Consumer Price Index.
Ah, yes, the big inflation gauge.
Exactly. CPI measures pricing power and inflation. Because remember, if GDP goes up just because prices doubled, that's not real growth.
Right. If I sell the exact same loaf of bread for $10 instead of $5, GDP goes up, but I didn't actually create more value. I just made bread twice as expensive.
Exactly. That's just inflation eating your lunch, literally.
Hmm.
So you need CPI to adjust the GDP numbers and see what's really happening to actual purchasing power.
That makes total sense. And the second indicator,
The monthly unemployment report. But specifically, the source points to the assessment of weekly non-farm payroll.
why non-farm specifically? Why do economists always hate farmers?
They don't hate farmers, but agriculture is incredibly seasonal and highly volatile. It depends entirely on the weather and harvest seasons. If you want a stable underlying indicator of the core industrial and service economy, you have to strip out the farms to see the real trend.
Okay, so non-farm payrolls tell us the truth about the job market.
Right, and this brings the human element back into the dashboard. Are people actually working? Because you can totally have a situation where GDP is super high, but unemployment is also really high.
Which would mean what? Robots are just doing all the work.
Essentially, yes. Automation or just extreme inequality. A high GDP coupled with high unemployment suggests an economy that is producing a lot of stuff, but leaving a whole lot of people behind. It's what economists call jobless growth.
So to get the real bottom line, as the source puts it, you really have to be a bit of a detective.
A true analysis requires synthesis. You have to look at GDP for the sheer size of the domestic production. Then you look at GNP to see if that wealth is actually staying with your citizens. You check the CPI to make sure inflation isn't just secretly eroding your gains. And you check employment rates to see if people actually have jobs to participate in that economy.
It's all about connecting the dots.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's about realizing that the economy is an ecosystem. You can't judge a forest's health just by counting the number of trees. You need to look at the soil, the water quality, the wildlife. These metrics, GDP, GNP, CPI, they're just different tools used to measure different parts of that same ecosystem.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Let's try to wrap this up with a nice bow. We started by saying GDP is the king, but we've clearly learned the king might be missing a few accessories.
He's definitely not wearing the whole outfit.
GDP is great for measuring the size of the engine. It tells us we are making stuff within our borders, but it doesn't tell us how efficient the engine is, or, to go back to your earlier point, how the passengers, the actual citizens, are feeling about the ride.
And we also learned that even though the U.S. switched to GDP in 1991, mostly just to make it easier to compare ourselves to the rest of the world, we really shouldn't forget about GNP.
Especially not now.
No, especially not in a hyper-globalized economy. The difference between what we make here, which is GDP, and what our people actually earn, which is GNP, can be incredibly significant. If you ignore that gap, you might completely misunderstand the true wealth of a nation's people.
You might think the country's super rich, when really it's just a physical location where wealthy foreign companies are parking their machines.
Precisely.
Which brings me back to that 50-hour work week scenario. It's funny because we are so conditioned from birth to just cheer for growth. Growth is good. Growth is the goal. But that thought experiment really sticks with me.
It raises a vital question about our underlying values.
Right. And I really want to leave you with this thought to mull over today. We've established that we can juice the numbers. We can make the GDP chart go completely vertical if we all just worked nonstop, never took vacations, and maximized our output at the expense of literally everything else in our lives.
We could build a very, very impressive-looking chart.
But here is the provocation. If a country's GDP doubles, but its citizens have zero free time to actually enjoy the fruits of that labor, can we really call that a successful economy? Or have we just built a really, really efficient treadmill?
It forces you to ask the ultimate question. What is the economy actually for? Is it to generate impressive numbers, or is it to generate a good life?
That is the question. Think about that the next time you see a headline cheering about record quarterly growth. Thanks for diving in with us today.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.